The courtroom was suffocating, heavy with silence, as if the very air carried the weight of accusation. Sergeant Ethan Carter sat at the center of it all, his military uniform crisp but painfully out of place against the grim backdrop of the trial. His chest bore medals that spoke of courage, loyalty, and sacrifice, none of which seemed to matter anymore. His hands were cuffed in front of him, resting on the table like they belonged to a man who had already accepted his fate. Ethan wasn't a villain. He wasn't a murderer. At least, not in his mind. But the military court had decided otherwise. 2 civilians had died during a mission overseas, and someone had to pay the price. That someone was him. No amount of testimony or evidence seemed to sway the courtroom. The jury had stared at him, expressionless and cold, as if his years of service meant nothing compared to the lives he was accused of taking. And now, with his sentencing day looming, Ethan had stopped trying to argue. The system was rigged, and he was just a cog crushed in its machinery. But today, for the first time in weeks, Ethan spoke. His voice, gravelly and hesitant, broke the oppressive quiet like a hammer against glass. "I have one last request," he said, his words steady but lined with an emotion that made the judge glance up sharply. The room shifted uncomfortably. Eyes turned toward him, some curious, others indifferent. Ethan's throat tightened, but he forced himself to continue. "Before my sentence is carried out, I'd like to see my partner Jagger. Just one last time." A murmur rippled through the room at the mention of Jagger's name. Ethan wasn't talking about a fellow soldier. Jagger was a Belgian Malinois, AK-9, trained to serve and protect on the battlefield. He'd been Ethan's partner for years, sharing the same dangers, the same victories, and the same losses. Their bond was unshakable, forged in the fires of combat and survival. Jagger had been more than a dog. He'd been a lifeline, a friend. The judge's gavel struck hard, calling for silence. He peered over his glasses, clearly caught off guard by the unusual request. "Sergeant Carter, this court has never handled a request like this." "I'm not sure." "Your Honor." A voice cut through the tension. All eyes turned to Captain Emma Wilson, who had risen from her seat in the back of the courtroom. She was a striking figure, with sharp features and a presence that demanded attention. Emma had served alongside Ethan in the field, and while many had turned their backs on him during the trial, she had not. "Jagger isn't just a dog," Emma said firmly. "He's a veteran. He saved lives, risked his own, and served this country with as much honor as any human soldier. Denying this request would be inhumane." The judge leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable as he considered her words. The silence stretched, each second thick with tension. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "Very well. This court grants your request, Sergeant Carter. You will have 10 minutes with the K-9, under strict supervision. No more." Ethan closed his eyes, a faint tremor passing through him. He hadn't expected the request to be granted, and now that it had, he wasn't sure what to feel. Relief? Sadness? Perhaps a strange mixture of both. As the courtroom emptied, Ethan was escorted to a private room by 2 guards. The walls were bare, the lighting harsh, and the air reeked of disinfectant. Each step he took felt heavier than the last, and by the time he sat down on the cold metal chair in the center of the room, his hands were trembling. Not from fear, from the weight of what this moment meant. Then he heard it, a sound that sliced through the sterile quiet like a lifeline. The faint click of claws on the floor, the soft jingle of a collar. The door creaked open, and there he was. Jagger. The dog didn't hesitate. He moved toward Ethan with a sense of purpose. His amber eyes locked onto the man who had been his partner, his protector, and his pack. Ethan leaned forward, and as Jagger placed his paws on his chest, the soldier crumbled. The hardened exterior, the stoic resolve, it all shattered in an instant. Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he cradled Jagger's head in his hands, burying his fingers in the dog's fur. "You never gave up on me, did you, boy?" Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Jagger let out a soft whine, pressing his muzzle against Ethan's cheek as if to say, "I'm still here." But as the seconds ticked by, Ethan's expression changed. A flicker of something long buried stirred in his eyes, something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. A fragmented memory began to surface, pulling at the edges of his mind. Something from the night that had sealed his conviction. A detail he had missed. And for the first time in months, Ethan felt a spark of resolve. Ethan's mind churned as fragments of the past pushed their way to the surface. That night, the mission that had unraveled his life, played on repeat in his head like a haunting reel of memories. The muffled shouts of his team, the gunfire tearing through the humid air, and the chaos that followed. He had replayed it 1,000 times in his cell, searching for answers that refused to come. But now, with Jagger pressed close, the warmth of the dog's steady presence unlocked something he hadn't noticed before. A voice. Not just any voice. It was familiar, sharp, and commanding. Someone from his own team had given a direct order that hadn't made sense at the time, but now it clicked like a puzzle piece snapping into place. His heart pounded as he tried to cling to the memory, to sharpen it. It was fleeting, frustratingly vague, but it was there. Someone had deliberately steered the mission into disaster. Someone had set them up. Jagger, he murmured, his voice trembling as he looked into the dog's knowing eyes. You were there. You saw it. Jagger responded with a soft bark, his ears perking up as if he understood the weight of Ethan's words. Ethan's thoughts raced. He had been so consumed by despair during the trial that he hadn't questioned the details as much as he should have. He hadn't fought hard enough because, deep down, he thought he deserved to bear the blame. After all, he had been the leader. The responsibility had fallen on him. But now, this sliver of clarity threatened to crack open everything he thought he knew. The guards at the door cleared their throats, a sharp reminder that his time was running out. 5 minutes, one of them said gruffly. 5 minutes. It wasn't enough. Not to process what he was remembering, not to figure out what to do, and certainly not to say goodbye to Jagger. The dog looked up at him, unyielding, as if to remind him that giving up wasn't an option. Ethan leaned closer, his forehead resting against Jagger's. If only you could talk, he whispered. Then it hit him. Jagger had been talking in a way. His vest, the military-grade camera attached to it during missions, had recorded everything. If that footage still existed, it might hold the truth Ethan so desperately needed. Proof that he hadn't fired the fatal shots. Proof that he wasn't the monster the world believed him to be. But the footage was as good as buried. After the trial, the evidence had been locked away, sealed behind layers of bureaucracy, or worse, destroyed. Jagger himself had been reassigned, separated from Ethan before he could even grieve the loss of his partner. Yet, in this moment, Ethan felt the smallest glimmer of hope. It wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. If someone on his team had orchestrated the deaths of innocent civilians, they couldn't be allowed to walk free. Ethan couldn't bear the weight of knowing the truth without acting on it. I'll figure it out, he promised, his voice steady now, his resolve hardening. Jagger let out another whine, pressing closer to Ethan, as if to offer silent reassurance. The guards stepped forward, their expressions cold and detached. Time's up, one of them said, his hand already reaching for Jagger's leash. Ethan's chest tightened as he placed his hands on either side of Jagger's face. I'll fix this, he said, his voice low but fierce. Whatever it takes, I'll fix this. The dog stared back at him, unwavering, before being pulled away by the guards. Jagger resisted, his claws scraping against the floor as he turned back toward Ethan, letting out a soft whimper that cut through the air like a knife. The door slammed shut, and Ethan was alone again. The silence of the room felt louder than ever, pressing down on him with an unbearable weight. But something had shifted inside him. Where there had been resignation, there was now determination. He wasn't ready to go quietly. Not yet. Hours later, Ethan sat on the edge of his cot in the dim confines of his cell. The hum of the fluorescent light overhead was the only sound, a monotonous reminder of time slipping away. His fingers traced the faint scratch marks on the cement wall, his desperate attempt to track the days since his conviction. He stared at them now with new eyes. Every mark was a reminder of how close he was to the end. But now he had a sliver of a plan. It wasn't much, and it wasn't certain, but it was something. He would find the footage. Somehow. He didn't know how to begin, trapped as he was in a cell. But he thought of Captain Emma Wilson. She had stood up for him when no one else did. She had risked her reputation to speak out in court, defending the man she knew rather than the man the prosecution had painted. If anyone could help him, it was her. Ethan exhaled deeply, his fists clenching. The weight of his fate hadn't lifted, but now it felt different. There was a fight left in him, and it wasn't just for himself. It was for Jagger, for Emma, for the truth. And if it took everything he had, he would find a way to uncover it. The steady rhythm of boots echoed down the concrete hallway as Ethan sat in his cell, his thoughts running circles around the faint hope he had grasped earlier. His request to see Jagger hadn't just brought back memories. It had unearthed possibilities. But possibilities meant nothing without action, and action seemed impossible in the confines of his cell. Every moment that passed was another step closer to his execution, the clock ticking mercilessly toward the inevitable. He had to reach Emma. Somehow. Ethan's fingers drummed against the cold metal bed frame as he considered his options. Death row wasn't a place for favors or exceptions, but there were loopholes, small mercies granted to men with days left to live. He needed to make a call, but he couldn't afford to waste it on a plea or goodbye. No, this call had to count. Later that evening, under the watchful eye of a guard, Ethan was escorted to the phone room. The handset felt foreign in his hand, as though it belonged to another life. He dialed Emma Wilson's number from memory, praying she hadn't changed it. Each ring felt like a lifetime, until finally, the line clicked and her familiar voice came through. Hello. Emma's voice was cautious but unmistakable, the rustling of papers in the background hinting at her busy routine. Emma, it's me. Ethan kept his voice steady, though his heart was pounding. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, followed by a pause. Ethan, how are you even calling me? She asked, her tone a mix of surprise and concern. There's no time for explanations, Ethan said quickly, glancing at the guard who stood stone-faced beside him. Listen to me. The footage from Jagger's vest, do you think it still exists? If it does, it could prove I didn't fire those shots. The line went silent for a moment, and Ethan's stomach twisted in the pause. Then, Emma's voice returned, this time quieter, more deliberate. After the trial, most of the evidence was classified or destroyed, but if it's still out there, it would be buried in the secure evidence vault at the base. Ethan, that's not an easy place to access. Ethan tightened his grip on the phone. I wouldn't ask if I had another choice. If there's even a chance that footage exists, I need you to find it. Please. Emma sighed, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might say no. But then, her voice softened, laced with determination. I'll see what I can do. But Ethan, if they catch me digging into this, my career is over. You understand that, right? I know, Ethan said, his voice cracking slightly. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't life or death. The guard motioned for him to hang up, and Ethan spoke quickly. Be careful, Emma. And thank you. As the call ended, Ethan was escorted back to his cell. The faintest spark of hope lingered, but it came with the weight of guilt. He had asked Emma to risk everything for him, and there was no guarantee it would lead anywhere. He stared at the ceiling, his mind a battlefield of doubt and desperation. Meanwhile, Emma faced her own set of challenges. The military base was a fortress, and the secure evidence vault was its crown jewel, protected by layers of protocol and surveillance. Gaining access wouldn't just be risky, it would be reckless. But Emma had made a promise to Ethan, and that promise burned in her chest as she sat in her office, staring at her computer screen. She couldn't let him down. Late that night, Emma parked her car outside the base, her heart hammering against her ribs. The hallways she had walked 100 times before now felt alien and threatening, the shadows deeper, the air heavier. She had timed her movements carefully, avoiding the usual night patrol. With her keycard in hand, she approached the first checkpoint and swiped it, holding her breath as the scanner blinked. A green light appeared, and the door unlocked with a faint click. So far, so good. Inside the vault, the sterile smell of metal and cold air filled her nostrils. Row after row of lockers stretched out before her, each containing fragments of missions long forgotten. Emma scanned the labels, searching for the one tied to Ethan's last mission, Operation Dawn Strike. Her fingers trembled as she finally spotted it. A tag bearing the mission's designation. She opened the drawer and rifled through the contents, reports, photographs, and finally, a small, dust-covered hard drive. Her breath caught in her throat as she held it in her hands. This tiny device could be the key to Ethan's innocence. But before she could let the relief sink in, the sound of footsteps echoed outside the vault. Emma froze, her heart racing as shadows shifted under the door. She slipped the hard drive into her jacket and backed into a corner, her mind spinning. The door creaked open, and a flashlight beam swept across the room. "Who's there?" a voice barked, sharp and commanding. Emma's pulse thundered in her ears as she pressed herself against the wall, the hard drive a heavy weight in her pocket. She had come too far to be caught now. Her only option was escape. Spotting a maintenance hatch in the corner, she crept toward it as silently as she could. The guards outside seemed to be scanning the room, but hadn't yet noticed her. With a quick, desperate motion, Emma pushed open the hatch and slid into the narrow passage. The door behind her began to open fully, but she didn't look back. Crawling through the cramped space, her breath came in short gasps. When she emerged into the cool night air outside, her lungs burned, but she didn't stop. The hard drive was safe for now, but the danger was far from over. Emma's hands were still trembling as she drove away from the base, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. The hard drive in her jacket pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, the gravity of what she had just done pressing down on her. She wasn't sure if the guards had seen her or if her absence would be noticed, but the risk she had taken was staggering. If anyone found out she had been inside that vault, her career would be over, assuming they didn't charge her with espionage or worse. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, jolting her from her spiraling thoughts. She glanced at the screen. The number was blocked. Hesitating for a moment, she picked it up. "Hello, Captain Wilson," a voice said, low and deliberate. Her blood ran cold. "This is Colonel Briggs. I believe we need to have a word." Emma's heart stopped. Colonel Briggs was one of the highest-ranking officers on base, and someone she had always considered to be by the book. If he was calling her now, it wasn't good news. "Sir," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Is there a problem?" There was a pause on the other end before he spoke again, his tone sharp and unyielding. "We've received reports of suspicious activity in the evidence vault. I trust you know anything about that." Emma gripped the phone tighter, her mind racing. How much did he know? Had the guard seen her? "No, sir," she replied, trying to sound calm. "I've been off duty tonight." Another pause. She could hear the faint shuffle of papers in the background. "Very well," Briggs said finally, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe her. "We'll be reviewing security footage from the vault. If anything comes to light, I expect your full cooperation." "Of course, sir," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. The line went dead. She pulled the car over to the side of the road, her chest heaving as the adrenaline finally caught up with her. This wasn't just about helping Ethan anymore. She had crossed a line, and now she was squarely in the crosshairs of the system she had spent her life serving. But there was no turning back. Not now. Not when Ethan's life was at stake. Back in his cell, Ethan was growing restless. The faint spark of hope Emma had given him was enough to keep him from sinking into despair, but it was a double-edged sword. The more he thought about the possibility of clearing his name, the more he worried about what would happen if they failed. His execution date loomed closer with each passing hour, and he couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away faster than he could grasp it. The guards had grown colder, more detached in their interactions with him. He caught fragments of their conversations when they thought he wasn't listening. Whispers about a transfer, rumors about his final days. It was clear they didn't expect him to fight back. To them, he was already a dead man. But Ethan had other plans. He began piecing together what little he knew. If Emma could recover the footage, it would be enough to prove his innocence. But that wasn't the end of the problem. Someone in his unit had betrayed him, and they weren't likely to sit idly by while the truth came to light. That meant Emma was in danger. The thought made his chest tighten with guilt. He had already dragged her into this mess. and now she was risking everything for him. A knock on the bars of his cell jolted him from his thoughts. One of the guards stood there, his expression unreadable. "Carter," he said gruffly. "You've got a visitor." Ethan frowned. Visitors weren't common on death row, especially not for him. He was led to the visitation room, his hands cuffed in front of him. When he stepped inside, he froze. Sitting at the table was Lieutenant Greg Harlow. The sight of his former teammate made Ethan's stomach turn. Harlow was the last person he expected to see, and the smirk on the man's face didn't help. "Sergeant Carter," Harlow said, leaning back in his chair. "You're looking well. What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, his voice low and cautious. Harlow shrugged, his eyes glinting with something cold and calculating. "Just thought I'd pay my respects. After all, it's not every day you get to see an old friend before they—" He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Ethan's jaw tightened. "I don't have time for your games, Harlow. Say what you came to say." Leaning forward, Harlow dropped his smirk, his tone turning icy. "You should have kept your mouth shut, Carter. Whatever you think you're trying to prove, it won't work. You're not just going up against me. You're going up against the whole system, and the system always wins." Ethan's fists clenched beneath the table. Harlow's words confirmed what he had suspected all along. The man was behind the setup, but hearing it out loud, the smug confidence in his voice lit a fire in Ethan's chest. He couldn't let Harlow win. As Harlow stood to leave, he leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think Emma can save you? She's out of her depth. And when this is all over, she'll be in just as much trouble as you." Ethan watched as Harlow walked out, the door slamming shut behind him. His pulse raced, a mixture of anger and fear coursing through him. Harlow had made his move, and now Ethan had to make his. Time was running out, and the stakes were higher than ever. The depot's walls seemed to close in as the sound of screeching tires outside echoed through the empty space. Emma's pulse quickened, her fight-or-flight instinct screaming at her. Across the room, Ryan hunched over his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard as the upload progress bar inched forward. "Ryan," Emma whispered urgently, her voice trembling. "How much longer?" 60 seconds, he replied, not looking up. His tone was calm, but she could see the tension in his jaw and the sweat on his brow. Emma grabbed a wrench from a nearby workbench, her knuckles white as she gripped it tightly. She moved toward the entrance, positioning herself behind a stack of crates. The wrench felt small and inadequate in her hand, but it was better than nothing. She wasn't about to let Harlow's men walk in and erase everything they had fought for. The first shadow appeared in the doorway, followed by the faint click of a gun being cocked. Emma's breath caught. The man stepped inside cautiously, his weapon sweeping the room in smooth arcs. Emma stayed perfectly still, her heart thundering in her chest. Behind her, Ryan muttered under his breath, "Come on, come on," as the upload ticked closer to completion. The man in the doorway took another step forward, his eyes scanning the space. "Fan out," he barked over his shoulder, his voice cold and commanding. Two more figures appeared behind him, both armed, their footsteps heavy on the concrete floor. Emma tightened her grip on the wrench, willing herself to stay calm. Her mind raced with the realization that this wasn't just about saving Ethan anymore. If Harlow's men got to the footage, they wouldn't just delete it. They'd eliminate her and Ryan to ensure it stayed buried. One of the men moved closer to Ryan, the glow of the laptop screen catching his attention. "Over here," he called, raising his weapon. Emma didn't hesitate. With a burst of adrenaline, she stepped out from behind the crates and swung the wrench as hard as she could. The metal connected with a sickening crack, and the man crumpled to the floor. "Emma, they're coming," Ryan shouted, his voice laced with panic. She turned just in time to see another man raise his gun, but the deafening sound of a shot rang out before he could fire. Emma flinched, expecting the worst, but the man staggered backward and collapsed. She turned to see Ryan holding a small handgun, his hands trembling as he aimed at the third man, who had frozen in place. The final man dropped his weapon, his hands raised in surrender. The laptop let out a triumphant beep, signaling the upload was complete. Ryan exhaled sharply, lowering the gun as relief washed over him. "It's done," he said, his voice shaky. But Emma knew this wasn't over. The footage was out there now, but so was Harlow, and the system that protected him wouldn't go down without a fight. "We need to move," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "They'll send more. We can't stay here." As they scrambled to gather their things, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. Ethan's fate now hinged on the truth reaching the right people, and surviving long enough for it to matter. The sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Emma and Ryan exchanged a glance, their breaths ragged and nerves frayed. The upload was complete. The footage was out there, irreversible, a ticking time bomb for Harlow and everyone protecting him. But survival was their immediate concern. "Let's go," Emma urged, her voice barely above a whisper. She shoved the wrench into her bag and motioned for Ryan to follow her toward the depot's rear exit. They slipped out into the night, the crisp air biting against their skin. The depot was surrounded by a maze of old rail cars and crumbling structures, offering just enough cover to evade detection. Emma led the way, crouched low as she scanned the area. The faint crunch of gravel behind them sent a spike of fear through her chest. "They're still here," Ryan muttered, gripping the handgun tightly in his shaking hands. Emma glanced back at him, her expression serious. "Stay close, and don't fire unless you have no other choice." The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, accompanied by muffled voices. Emma tightened her grip on the strap of her bag, her thoughts racing. They had to make it to Ryan's car, parked a few blocks away. If they could reach it, they might have a chance to disappear before Harlow's men regrouped. As they crept along the edge of a rusted railcar, Emma heard the sharp crack of a twig snapping nearby. She froze, signaling for Ryan to stop. Her heart pounded as she peered around the corner, her eyes locking onto the silhouette of a man with a flashlight. He was scanning the area, his movements methodical. Emma motioned for Ryan to move quietly, but the man turned abruptly, the flashlight beam sweeping dangerously close to them. Without thinking, Emma lunged forward, grabbing an old metal coupling lying on the ground. She hurled it across the yard, the clatter echoing in the opposite direction. "Over there!" the man shouted, turning away to investigate. Emma didn't wait for him to reconsider. She and Ryan bolted, their footsteps muffled against the dirt. The flashlight beam danced erratically as the man realized he'd been misled. But by then, they were already disappearing into the shadows. Meanwhile, back at the prison, Ethan's world was crumbling around him. The guard's vague explanations about his transfer hadn't soothed his growing sense of dread. His hands were cuffed tightly as he was led down a dimly lit corridor, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering ominously. "Where are you taking me?" Ethan asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. The guard leading the way didn't answer, but the subtle glance exchanged between him and the one behind Ethan spoke volumes. They weren't taking him to another wing of the prison. They were taking him somewhere far worse. Panic clawed at Ethan's chest as the realization sank in. Harlow wasn't waiting for the legal system to run its course. He was cleaning up loose ends. They exited the main prison block, stepping into the cold night air. Ethan's breath fogged in front of him as they marched toward an unmarked van idling in the shadows. His mind raced, desperately trying to formulate a plan, but the cuffs around his wrists and the presence of armed guards left him with few options. As they approached the van, the sound of a low growl cut through the tense silence. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He turned his head toward the sound, and there, standing at the edge of the yard, was Jagger. The dog's silhouette was barely visible in the dim light, but Ethan knew it was him. His K-9 partner's ears were perked, his body tense, his amber eyes locked onto the guards. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. "Jagger," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. The guards turned, their confusion evident. One of them raised his weapon, but Jagger didn't hesitate. With a ferocious snarl, the dog charged, his powerful frame a blur as he lunged at the nearest guard. The man screamed as Jagger sank his teeth into his arm, the gun clattering to the ground. The second guard fumbled for his weapon, but Ethan seized the opportunity. He slammed his shoulder into the man, knocking him off balance. The impact sent them both tumbling to the ground, and Ethan didn't waste a second. He rolled to his side, his hand scrambling for the fallen gun. Jagger released the first guard and turned to face the second, standing protectively in front of Ethan. The remaining guard hesitated, his weapon half raised as he faced the snarling dog and a furious soldier. "Drop it," Ethan ordered, his voice cold and commanding. He aimed the gun, his hand steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. The guard hesitated for a fraction of a second before lowering his weapon. Ethan kicked it away, his chest heaving as he stared down the man who moments ago had been ready to kill him. "Get in the van," Ethan growled, his eyes burning with intensity. The guard obeyed, his hands trembling as he climbed into the vehicle. Ethan crouched down beside Jagger, his hands finding the familiar warmth of the dog's fur. "Good boy," he murmured, his voice filled with gratitude and awe. But there was no time to savor the reunion. The sound of shouting echoed from the prison block, and Ethan knew reinforcements were coming. "Come on, Jagger," he said, rising to his feet. "We're not out of this yet." Ethan ran toward the perimeter fence, Jagger keeping pace at his side. The cold night air stung his face, but he didn't care. Every second counted. Behind him, shouts and alarms echoed across the prison yard as reinforcements scrambled to respond to the chaos. He could feel the weight of their pursuit closing in, but for the first time in months, Ethan had hope, and his partner on his side. The chain-link fence loomed ahead, topped with razor wire. Escape seemed impossible, but Ethan's focus remained sharp. Nearby, a maintenance truck was parked near a section of the fence. The back was loaded with crates, and a ladder was propped against the side. "That's our way out," Ethan muttered to Jagger, glancing at the dog as if he could understand. And maybe he did. Jagger barked softly and stayed close, his amber eyes scanning the surroundings for threats. Ethan climbed the ladder quickly, his hands still bound by the cuffs. Jagger leapt onto the back of the truck with ease, waiting for Ethan to reach the top. With a grunt of effort, Ethan balanced precariously on the edge of the ladder and used his foot to push the crates closer to the fence. Just as he was about to jump, the sound of gunfire split the air. Bullets whizzed past, striking the truck's metal frame with sharp, echoing pings. Ethan ducked instinctively, his heart hammering in his chest. "Hold on," he shouted to Jagger, grabbing the edge of the fence and pulling himself up. Jagger barked again, leaping gracefully over the crates and landing on the other side of the fence. Ethan followed, landing hard on the ground below. Pain shot through his knees, but he forced himself to keep moving. The two sprinted into the darkness, weaving through the brush and trees that bordered the prison. Behind them, flashlights bobbed in the distance, accompanied by the distant shouts of guards. "Ethan, we've got to move faster," he muttered to himself, adrenaline fueling every step. As they pushed deeper into the woods, the noise behind them began to fade. The thick trees and uneven terrain slowed their pursuers, buying Ethan and Jagger precious time. But even as the immediate threat diminished, Ethan knew they weren't safe. Harlow wouldn't stop. The footage might be out there, but Ethan's death was still the easiest way to ensure the truth stayed buried. Miles away, Emma and Ryan weren't out of danger either. Ryan's laptop beeped, signaling that the footage had been successfully uploaded to multiple whistleblower sites. He leaned back, letting out a shaky breath. "It's live," he said, turning to Emma. "Anyone who's paying attention will see it." Emma nodded, but her expression remained grim. "Harlow's not going to sit back and let this play out. He'll come after us, and he won't stop until it's too late." Ryan closed the laptop and began packing their gear. "Then we don't give him the chance. We need to find Ethan before he does." Emma grabbed her bag and slung it over her shoulder. "If he's alive, he'll head for the safe house outside the city. It's the only place he knows to go." Ryan nodded. "Then let's not waste time." As they stepped outside, Emma glanced up at the night sky. Somewhere out there, Ethan and Jagger were fighting to survive, and she wasn't going to let them face this battle alone. Ethan's legs burned as he pushed through the thick underbrush, the uneven terrain threatening to trip him with every step. Jagger stayed close, his movements swift and calculated despite the chaos. The sound of pursuit had faded entirely now, replaced by the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Ethan slowed, his breath heaving as he crouched down to rest against a tree. Jagger stood alert beside him, his ears perked and his gaze scanning their surroundings. For the first time since their escape, Ethan allowed himself to think, to process. They were alive for now, but survival wasn't enough. If Harlow's men didn't catch up to him, the system would. He needed to get word to Emma and Ryan, to let them know he was still in the fight, and he needed to figure out his next move before his luck ran out. Jagger pressed his head against Ethan's arm, a quiet reassurance that grounded him in the moment. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's neck, his fingers sinking into the familiar warmth of his fur. "We're not done yet, buddy," he murmured, "but at least we've got a fighting chance." A faint buzz broke the stillness, and Ethan froze. It took a second to realize it was coming from the guard's phone, which he had grabbed during the scuffle at the van. He pulled it from his pocket, staring at the screen. No signal. The prison's jammers had cut off communication, but out here, far enough from the facility, he might be able to reach Emma. He powered the phone off and back on, holding his breath as the screen flickered to life. A single bar of reception appeared in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Miles away, Emma and Ryan were closing in on the safe house. The small, dilapidated cabin on the outskirts of the city had been a lifeline for Emma in the past. It was a place she had used to lay low during high-pressure missions, a place no one in the military knew about. As the car rumbled down the gravel path leading to the cabin, Emma's mind raced. She had no way of knowing if Ethan had made it, or if he was even alive. But she clung to hope, gripping the steering wheel tightly as the headlights illuminated the building ahead. Ryan glanced at her, his voice quiet. "You really think he'll be here?" Emma nodded, though her expression betrayed her uncertainty. "If he's out there, he'll come here. He knows it's safe." They parked a short distance away and approached the cabin cautiously. The door creaked as Emma pushed it open, her heart sinking when she saw the dark, empty interior. Dust covered the furniture, and the air smelled stale. It was clear no one had been there in weeks. Ryan sighed, setting his bag down on the table. "So what now?" Emma didn't answer right away. She pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. "We wait," she said finally, her voice steady despite the knot in her chest. "And we pray he makes it." Back in the woods, Ethan's call finally connected. The phone rang twice before Emma's voice came through, sharp and urgent. "Hello, Emma," Ethan said, his voice low and breathless. Relief washed over him when he heard her gasp on the other end. "Ethan? Oh my God. Are you okay? Where are you?" Her words tumbled out in a rush, her concern palpable. "I'm alive," Ethan replied. "Barely. Jagger and I made it out of the prison, but Harlow's men are after us. I need your help." Emma's heart pounded as she exchanged a look with Ryan, who had already begun unpacking his equipment. "Where are you? Can you get to the safe house?" "I'm trying," Ethan said. "We're about 10 miles out, but I don't know how long we can keep going." "They'll find us eventually." Ryan leaned forward, his voice firm. "Tell him to stay off the roads and stick to cover. If Harlow's people are looking for him, they'll be monitoring every major route." Emma relayed the message, her mind racing. "Stay hidden, Ethan. We'll figure out a way to get you here safely. Just hang on." Ethan hesitated. "Emma, if I don't make it—" "Don't," she interrupted, her voice cracking. "You'll make it. We didn't come this far just to lose you now." There was a long pause before Ethan finally responded. "Okay, I'll see you soon." The line went dead, and Emma set the phone down, her hands trembling. Ryan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll get him here," he said quietly, "and we'll make this right." Emma nodded, but the weight of everything they had risked, and everything they still stood to lose, pressed heavily on her chest. Time was running out, and every second counted. The first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon as Ethan and Jagger stumbled into the clearing. The safe house was just ahead, its outline barely visible through the morning mist. Ethan's body ached, his legs heavy from exhaustion, but the sight of the cabin gave him the strength to push forward. Jagger stayed close, his steps as measured and protective as ever. When Ethan reached the door, it creaked open before he could knock. Emma stood there, her eyes wide with relief and disbelief. "Ethan," she breathed, stepping aside to let him in. "You made it." "Barely," he replied, managing a faint smile. Jagger patted in beside him, his tail wagging as he sniffed the room. Ryan appeared from behind the table, offering a quick nod before pulling a first aid kit from his bag. "We need to move quickly," Ryan said, setting the kit down. "The footage is live, and the media is already running with it. Harlow's people won't be far behind." Ethan collapsed into a chair, his breath finally slowing as the weight of the past 24 hours began to sink in. He looked at Emma, his expression serious. "The footage, does it show enough?" Emma nodded, her jaw set. "It's all there. Harlow's orders, the setup, everything. The public knows now, and so does the military. He can't hide from this." Ethan closed his eyes, relief washing over him. For the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe again. "Then it's over." But Emma shook her head. "Not yet. Harlow's still out there, and he won't go down without a fight." As if on cue, the distant sound of tires crunching gravel reached their ears. Emma's eyes met Ethan's, and Ryan quickly moved to the window, peeking through the curtains. "We got company," he muttered. 3 vehicles. Armed. Ethan stood, his exhaustion forgotten as adrenaline surged through him. "Then we make this the end," he said. He looked down at Jagger, who was already alert and ready. "We've got one more fight in us, don't we, boy?" Jagger barked softly, his ears twitching as the vehicles came to a stop outside. The confrontation was swift and decisive. With Ryan's technical expertise, Emma's tactical precision, and Ethan's unrelenting resolve, they outmaneuvered Harlow's men. The sound of sirens in the distance signaled the arrival of law enforcement, summoned by the broadcasted footage and the mounting pressure from the media. Harlow was arrested on the spot, his attempt to plead innocence drowned out by the overwhelming evidence. Ethan stood by the window, watching as his former teammate was led away in handcuffs, his once arrogant demeanor replaced with fear. Jagger sat at Ethan's side, his steady presence a reminder of what they had endured together. Days later, Ethan stood outside the military tribunal, the sunlight warm on his face. His name had been cleared, his record restored. The charges against him were dropped, and Harlow's corruption was being dismantled piece by piece. But the scars of the experience remained, a reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. As Ethan knelt to ruffle Jagger's fur, the dog licked his face, his tail wagging. "We did it, boy," Ethan said softly. "We're free." Emma approached, a faint smile on her lips. "So what now?" Ethan looked at her, then at Jagger. "We move forward, together." And as they walked away, leaving the shadows of betrayal and injustice behind, Ethan felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope.